Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of World War II espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's talk about a telegram that would expose the largest spy ring ever discovered on American soil and destroy everyone who touched it. On the afternoon of January 2nd, 1940, at approximately 2:47 p.m., a 48-year-old airplane mechanic named Hermann Lang walked into a Western Union office on East 86th Street in Manhattan's Yorkville neighborhood and handed the clerk a telegram addressed to an engineering firm in Hamburg, Germany. The message contained 19 seemingly innocuous words about industrial machinery specifications. Within 3 years, that telegram and dozens like it would become evidence in what federal prosecutors would describe as the largest espionage prosecution in United States history, a case involving 33 defendants, hundreds of secret messages, stolen military blueprints, and a spy network that had been operating inside America for more than a decade. Hermann Wilhelm Gustav Lang had been born in Würzburg, Germany in 1891. He had immigrated to the United States in 1927 at the age of 36, settling in Queens, New York, with his wife, Sophie. By 1940, Lang had been working for the Carl L. Norden Company in Manhattan for nearly 12 years. The Norden Company, a defense contractor employing approximately 1,400 people, manufactured what was considered the most sophisticated and closely guarded military technology of the era, the Norden bomb sight, a complex analog computer that allowed bomber crews to accurately target objectives from high altitude. The device was so sensitive that it carried a top-secret classification from the U.S. Army Air Corps and workers who handled its components were required to sign secrecy agreements, acknowledging that unauthorized disclosure could result in criminal prosecution. Lang's position at the Norden Company was inspector and assembly supervisor. His job required him to examine bomb sight components as they moved through the manufacturing process, ensuring that parts met precise specifications. This work gave him detailed knowledge of the device's internal mechanisms, knowledge that, according to later testimony, he had been systematically photographing and transmitting to German military intelligence since 1937. The telegram was coded. The machinery specifications it referenced were actually measurements and technical details related to recent modifications to the bomb sight stabilization system. The engineering firm in Hamburg was a mail drop operated by the Abwehr, Nazi Germany's military intelligence service. Lang had been recruited 3 years earlier during a visit to Germany, where Abwehr officers had appealed to his sense of German patriotism and had convinced him that providing technical information would help his homeland develop defensive capabilities against potential enemies. Between 1937 and 1941, he had photographed hundreds of pages of technical drawings, blueprints, and specifications, had reduced them to microfilm, and had transmitted them to Germany through various channels including mail drops, courier services, and personal delivery during transatlantic trips. Lang was not working alone. He was one node in a network of agents, couriers, and handlers that federal investigators would eventually identify as comprising at least 33 individuals operating in New York, New Jersey, and several other states. Some were German nationals living in America under various pretexts. Others were naturalized U.S. citizens or even native-born Americans of German descent. The network included mechanics, engineers, waiters, hairdressers, a ship's steward, and several individuals whose occupations seemed designed to provide cover for intelligence activities. At the center of this network was a 62-year-old man named Frederick Duquesne, a South African-born adventurer, con artist, and longtime operative who had been involved in intelligence work spanning 3 decades and 2 world wars. Duquesne had been born in 1877 in the Cape Colony, then part of the British Empire. His early life, as he told it in various accounts over the years, had been marked by conflict with British colonial authorities during the Second Boer War. Duquesne claimed that British forces had burned his family's farm and killed his mother and sister, instilling in him a lifelong hatred of Britain. Whether these specific claims were true remained disputed. Duquesne was a habitual fabricator whose autobiographical accounts shifted depending on his audience, but what was documented was his subsequent career as a spy, saboteur, journalist, lecturer, and confidence man operating across multiple continents. By 1940, Duquesne had been living in New York City for more than a decade, maintaining a small office in Midtown Manhattan where he operated what he described as an import-export consulting business. He lived with his wife, Evelyn, in a modest apartment on West 76th Street. Neighbors would later describe him as cultured and well-spoken, with a theatrical manner, a walking stick he carried as an affectation, and a tendency to tell elaborate stories about his adventures in Africa and South America. What neighbors did not know was that Duquesne had been recruited by the Abwehr in the mid-1930s to establish and coordinate an intelligence network inside the United States, with particular focus on gathering information about American military capabilities, ship movements, and industrial capacity. The investigation that would eventually expose Duquesne's network had begun not with Lang's telegram, but with an entirely different person 3 years earlier. In August 1937, a 33-year-old German-American named William Sebold walked into the U.S. Consulate in Cologne, Germany, and told a startled State Department official that German intelligence officers had coerced him into agreeing to work as a spy in America. William Sebold had been born Wilhelm Georg Debowski in Mülheim, Germany, in 1904. He had immigrated to the United States in 1922 at the age of 18, had worked various jobs, including as a mechanic and industrial worker, and had become a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1936. In February 1939, Sebold had traveled to Germany to visit his mother, who was ill. During this visit, he had been approached by Abwehr officers who knew details about his life in America and about minor legal troubles he'd had years earlier. The officers had suggested that Sebold could avoid difficulties for himself and his family in Germany by cooperating with German intelligence. They wanted him to return to the United States and establish himself as a communications relay for other agents, someone who could receive messages from operatives, encode them, and transmit them to Germany via shortwave radio. Sebold felt trapped. He feared for his mother and other relatives living in Germany, but he also felt loyalty to the United States, where he had built a life and obtained citizenship. After several sleepless nights weighing these impossible choices, he made his decision. He went to the U.S. Consulate and told officials what had happened. The State Department official who interviewed Sebold immediately contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Within days, FBI agents were debriefing Sebold and formulating a plan, rather than having Sebold simply refuse the German assignment, which would have alerted the Abwehr that their recruitment had failed and would have endangered Sebold's family. FBI officials proposed something far more ambitious. Sebold would pretend to cooperate with German intelligence, would return to the United States as instructed, but would actually be working under FBI control. He would establish the radio communications system the Germans wanted, but every transmission would be monitored and controlled by federal agents. Any contacts the Germans directed him to make with other agents would give the FBI direct access to the spy network. This type of operation, using a double agent to penetrate an espionage network, was relatively rare in 1939. The FBI's counterintelligence capabilities were still developing, having been granted authority to investigate foreign intelligence activities inside the United States only in 1936, when President Franklin Roosevelt had issued a classified directive expanding FBI jurisdiction. But FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover saw the Sebold case as an opportunity to demonstrate the Bureau's capabilities and to gather intelligence about German espionage activities in America. Sebold agreed to cooperate. In Germany, he continued his training with Abwehr handlers, learning radio transmission techniques, code systems, secret writing methods using invisible ink, and procedures for making contact with agents already operating in the United States. He was given the code name Tramp and was provided with a list of contacts in New York, addresses, telephone numbers, recognition signals, and cover stories for initial approaches. The Abwehr gave Sebold $1,000 in cash for his initial expenses and told him to establish himself in New York as a diesel engine consultant, a cover occupation that would allow him to travel and meet with various contacts without arousing suspicion. In February 1940, Sebold boarded a ship bound for New York. He carried with him a hollowed-out shaving brush containing microphotographs of instructions and contact information. FBI agents were waiting when the ship arrived. Over the following weeks, with Bureau supervision and assistance, Sebold established his cover identity as Harry Sawyer, rented an office at 152 West 42nd Street in Manhattan, and began setting up a shortwave radio transmission station in Centerport, Long Island. The radio station was the key to the FBI's strategy. Located in a house on Long Island, the station was staffed not by Sebold alone, but by FBI radio technicians who operated under his supervision. Every message that came from Germany would be intercepted, decoded, and analyzed. Every message sent to Germany would be composed by the FBI, though Sebold would be the one physically present during some transmissions to maintain the cover. The Germans believed they had established a secure communications channel with their spy network in America. In reality, they had provided the FBI with a direct view into their entire operation. The office at 152 West 42nd Street was equipped with a two-way mirror and hidden cameras. FBI agents operated from an adjacent room, filming every meeting that took place. This setup would prove crucial to building prosecutable cases against the network members. On May 20th, 1940, approximately 2 months after Sebold's return to New York, Hermann Lang made contact. He arrived at Sebold's office at approximately 3:15 p.m. He had been directed by his Abwehr handlers in Germany to meet with Sawyer and to establish a relationship for transmitting information. According to FBI surveillance logs, Lang was nervous during the meeting, repeatedly checking his watch and looking toward the door. He spoke in German, asking Sebold if he was the contact he had been told to find. Sebold confirmed his identity using a recognition phrase he had been given in Germany. Lang relaxed slightly and began explaining that he had technical information about aircraft bomb sites that needed to be transmitted to Germany. Over the next 45 minutes, while FBI cameras recorded the entire encounter, Lang provided Sebold with a package containing blueprints, photographs of Norden bomb site components, and handwritten notes describing recent modifications to the device's mechanisms. He explained that he had been photographing documents at the Norden facility for 3 years and had already transmitted substantial information through other channels, but that those channels had become unreliable. The blueprints and photographs Lang provided were immediately turned over to FBI technical analysts and to Army Air Corps intelligence officers. Their assessment was that the information was extraordinarily sensitive, detailed enough that German engineers could potentially reverse engineer critical components of the bomb site or develop countermeasures against its use. The fact that this information had been flowing to Germany for 3 years raised urgent questions about the full extent of the network. Lang was not arrested immediately. FBI officials decided to use Sebold's access to map the full extent of the network before moving to prosecution. Lang continued to meet regularly with Sawyer, providing additional technical information, and mentioning in passing during one meeting that he knew other people who were also helping Germany. On May 28, 1940, 8 days after Lang's first meeting, Frederick Duquesne himself arrived at Sebold's office at approximately 2:00 p.m. According to the FBI surveillance report, Duquesne spent nearly 2 hours in Sebold's office during this initial meeting, much of which he occupied with stories about his past exploits as an adventurer and intelligence operative. He described operations he claimed to have conducted during World War I, including sabotage of British ships and assassination attempts against British officials. He mentioned having worked for German intelligence during the 1930s and described his current role as coordinating intelligence gathering activities in New York. Duquesne's operational security was remarkably poor. He spoke openly about other members of the network, mentioning them by name and describing their roles. He explained that he served as a contact point and coordinator, receiving information from various agents and determining the best methods for transmitting it to Germany. The information Duquesne himself provided focused primarily on shipping, details about convoys departing from New York Harbor, ship movements, cargo manifests, and information about vessels being converted for potential military use. He obtained this information through contacts among harbor workers, ship's stewards, and dock personnel, supplemented by careful reading of shipping newspapers and time spent at waterfront bars where merchant sailors gathered. Through June and July 1940, as German forces conquered France and began preparing for a potential invasion of Britain, a steady stream of visitors arrived at Sebold's office. Each meeting was filmed. Each visitor was followed by FBI surveillance teams. Each piece of information they provided was documented and analyzed. The network members represented diverse backgrounds and specializations. Lily Stein, a 49-year-old Austrian-born woman who worked as a model and artist's representative, served as a courier between New York and South America, carrying messages and money to German agents operating in Brazil and Argentina. Everett Roeder, a 38-year-old machinist who worked at a plant in New Jersey that manufactured aircraft instruments, provided technical drawings and specifications. Paul Faissé, a 47-year-old ship's steward on vessels traveling between New York and South America, carried documents and microfilm concealed in his luggage. Axel Wheeler Hill, a 39-year-old American-born truck driver, conducted surveillance of military installations and reported on troop movements and equipment shipments. The network also included recruiters who identified potential sources. Franz Stigler, a 43-year-old German immigrant who owned a small import business, identified potential recruits among German-American communities and made initial approaches. Edmund Heine, a 45-year-old hairdresser who operated a salon in Yorkville, Manhattan's heavily German neighborhood, cultivated relationships with customers who worked in defense industries or government offices, gradually assessing their political sympathies and potential value as sources. By August 1940, the FBI had identified at least 25 individuals connected to the spy network. Surveillance teams followed these individuals to their homes, workplaces, and meeting locations. Telephone wiretaps captured conversations that revealed additional contacts. The radio station on Long Island maintained regular contact with Germany, sending carefully crafted messages that appeared to be genuine intelligence reports, but which were actually controlled by FBI analysts to avoid transmitting genuinely harmful information while maintaining the network's credibility with Abwehr handlers. The challenge facing FBI officials was determining when to move from investigation to arrest. Allowing the network to continue operating provided opportunities to identify additional agents and to gather evidence that would be admissible in court. But it also meant allowing the theft and attempted transmission of military secrets to continue, even under FBI control. There was also concern that the Abwehr might eventually detect that the operation had been compromised. The decision to move toward prosecution came in early 1941. By January, FBI officials concluded that the network had been sufficiently mapped and that evidence had been gathered for successful prosecutions. On January 2, 1941, federal agents in New York, New Jersey, and several other states executed a coordinated series of arrests targeting 33 individuals identified as members of the spy network. The arrests began before dawn. At approximately 5:30 a.m., FBI agents knocked on the door of Hermann Lang's apartment in Ridgewood, Queens. According to the arrest report, Lang answered the door wearing pajamas and appeared confused when agents identified themselves and informed him he was under arrest for espionage. He asked to speak with his wife before being taken into custody. Agents allowed a brief conversation during which Lang told Sophie that there had been some misunderstanding and that he would straighten things out. He was transported to the FBI's New York field office, where he was formally charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. At approximately the same time, other agents arrested Frederick Duquesne at his apartment on West 76th Street. Duquesne initially attempted to dismiss the charges as absurd, claiming he was a respected businessman and writer who had no involvement in espionage. When agents informed him they had photographic and audio recordings of his meetings with William Sebold and that they had intercepted dozens of messages he had transmitted, Duquesne became silent. His wife, Evelyn, who had no knowledge of her husband's intelligence activities, began crying and asking what was happening. She had believed her husband was a business consultant and writer, and the revelation would destroy their marriage within days of comprehending its full meaning. The coordinated arrests continued throughout the morning and into the afternoon. Lily Stein was arrested at Pennsylvania Station as she prepared to board a train to Florida. Everett Roeder was arrested at the New Jersey machine shop where he worked. Paul Fese was arrested aboard a ship docked in New York Harbor. By the end of January 2, 1941, 33 individuals had been taken into custody. The arrests made headlines in newspapers across the country. The New York Times ran the story on its front page under the headline, "FBI seizes 33 as spies for Germany. Bomb site, data sent." The story described the operation as the most comprehensive counter-espionage investigation ever conducted in the United States. The central trial, focusing on the 19 defendants considered most culpable, began in Federal District Court in Brooklyn on September 3, 1941. The case was assigned to Judge Mortimer W. Byers. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Harold M. Kennedy, who had been preparing the case since shortly after the arrests. The challenge Kennedy faced was presenting evidence in ways that would be comprehensible to jurors while maintaining secrecy around certain intelligence sources and methods. The defense strategy varied among the defendants. Some, including Hermann Lang, initially denied any wrongdoing and claimed they had been entrapped by Sebold acting as an FBI agent provocateur. Defense attorneys argued that their clients had been duped by skilled German handlers who had manipulated their patriotic feelings. Lang's attorney presented character witnesses who testified about his dedication to his work and his reputation as a devoted family man. The prosecution countered by presenting evidence that Lang had been paid substantial sums, approximately $27, 000 over 4 years, undermining claims of purely ideological motivation. Others acknowledged having contact with Sebold, but claimed they had not understood the nature of what they were doing or had been coerced by threats against family members in Germany. Still others, including Frederick Duquesne, offered no coherent defense strategy at all, remaining largely silent as evidence accumulated against them. William Sebold testified for the prosecution over 6 days in late September and early October 1941. His testimony covered his recruitment by the Abwehr in Germany, his training in espionage techniques, his establishment of the radio station and cover identity in New York, and his interactions with each of the defendants. The prosecution presented film footage taken through the two-way mirror in Sebold's office, showing each defendant arriving, speaking with Sebold, transferring documents or information, and departing. The films were particularly damaging because they provided visual documentation that was difficult to dispute. Hermann Lang was shown handing packages of documents to Sebold and explaining in detail what information the documents contained. Frederick Duquesne was shown discussing ship movements and describing how information should be transmitted to Germany. Lily Stein was shown receiving documents from Sebold to carry to South America. The prosecution also presented technical experts who testified about the sensitivity of the information that had been stolen. A naval intelligence officer explained the significance of the Norden bomb site and the potential impact of its specifications falling into German hands. An Army engineer described the value of information about aircraft manufacturing processes and industrial capacity. The defense's argument that defendants had been entrapped by FBI agent Sebold encountered a fundamental problem. Sebold had not initiated these relationships or encouraged criminal behavior that defendants were not already engaged in. The defendants had approached Sebold because they had been directed to do so by German intelligence handlers. They had provided information voluntarily and had discussed their ongoing espionage activities. The legal doctrine of entrapment requires that government agents induce someone to commit a crime they were not otherwise predisposed to commit. The evidence clearly showed that the defendants were already engaged in espionage before ever meeting Sebold. On December 13, 1941, 6 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States entry into World War II, the jury returned guilty verdicts against all 19 defendants on trial. According to newspaper accounts, several defendants showed no visible reaction when the verdicts were read. Others appeared stunned or began crying. Hermann Lang stared at the jury with what one reporter described as an expression of disbelief. Sentencing took place 3 weeks later. Judge Byers handed down sentences ranging from 18 months to 18 years in federal prison, depending on each defendant's level of culpability and the extent of their participation in the network. Hermann Lang received 18 years, the maximum sentence possible under the applicable statutes. In his sentencing statement, Judge Byers noted that Lang had held a position of trust at the Norden Company, had systematically violated that trust for years, had provided extraordinarily sensitive military information to a hostile foreign power, and had done so for personal gain. The judge said Lang's actions had struck at the very foundation of national security, at a time when the nation's survival may depend on the advantages provided by the technology he betrayed. Frederick Duquesne received 18 years. with Judge Byers describing him as the spider at the center of this web of deceit and noting his decades-long career in espionage and sabotage. Lily Stein received 10 years, Everett Roeder received 16 years, Paul Facer received 15 years. The 14 additional defendants who had been arrested but who faced separate proceedings were tried in subsequent months. Most pleaded guilty and received sentences ranging from 18 months to 10 years. By the end of 1942, all 33 individuals arrested had been convicted and were serving federal prison sentences. The FBI and military intelligence agencies conducted extensive reviews of what information had been compromised and what impact it might have on military operations. The assessment regarding the Norden bomb site was particularly concerning. Hermann Lang's theft had occurred between 1937 and 1941, and evidence suggested that at least some of this information had successfully reached Germany before the FBI had gained control of Sebold's radio link. However, the actual operational impact appeared to be limited. German forces never deployed a comparable device during the war, suggesting either that they could not successfully reverse engineer it from the stolen plans or that they chose not to prioritize its development. American strategic bombing campaigns using the Norden bomb site proceeded throughout the war without encountering German countermeasures that would suggest the enemy had detailed knowledge of the device's workings. The information about shipping and convoy movements that Duquesne and others had collected was potentially more immediately valuable to German U-boat operations in the Atlantic. However, by the time the spy ring was broken up, the information flow had been under FBI control for more than 8 months. The messages transmitted through Sebold's radio station had been carefully composed by FBI analysts to avoid providing genuinely useful intelligence. For the individuals convicted in the case, the consequences extended far beyond their prison sentences. Hermann Lang served 16 years in federal prison before being paroled in 1958. He was immediately deported to Germany, arriving in a country that had been divided into East and West, devastated by war, and bearing little resemblance to the homeland he had left in 1927. He was then 67 years old, had no family in Germany. His parents and siblings had all died during or shortly after the war, and possessed skills that were largely obsolete. He found work as a bookkeeper at a small manufacturing firm in Stuttgart and lived in a modest apartment alone. According to individuals who knew him in his later years, he rarely spoke about his past or about his years in America. He died in 1968 at the age of 77. Sophie Lang had remained in the United States after her husband's conviction. She had returned to her maiden name and had moved from Queens to a different apartment in Brooklyn to escape the notoriety associated with the case. She worked as a seamstress and cleaning woman, struggling financially but maintaining her independence. When Hermann was deported in 1958, she did not accompany him or maintain regular contact. According to a brief interview she gave to a researcher in 1965, she said that she had made a life here, separate from all of that, and that she preferred not to discuss her former husband. She died in 1972 at the age of 80. Frederick Duquesne never completed his prison sentence. He suffered declining health in federal custody, including heart problems and complications from diabetes. In 1944, he was transferred from the maximum security facility where he had initially been held to a federal medical facility in Springfield, Missouri. He died there on May 24, 1956, at the age of 78. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. He was buried in a pauper's grave in Springfield with no family present and no service held. Evelyn Duquesne divorced Frederick in 1943 while he was in prison. She moved to California and remarried, attempting to rebuild a life far from the scandal and devastation of her first marriage. In later years, she would tell friends that discovering the truth about her husband felt like learning she had been married to a stranger, that the man she thought she knew had never actually existed. She declined to claim his body or effects when he died in 1956. The children of defendants faced particular challenges. Emma Roeder, the 14-year-old daughter of convicted spy Everett Roeder, was removed from her school by her mother after other students harassed her and called her father a traitor. According to later interviews, Emma struggled with depression throughout her teenage years and eventually changed her last name when she reached adulthood to escape association with the case. She rarely spoke about her father and declined to visit him in prison after her initial visit in 1942, during which, she later said, she could not recognize the man who sat across from me as the father I had known. The shame and confusion of having a parent imprisoned for espionage against the United States marked her entire adolescence and influenced decisions she would make decades later about whether to marry or have children of her own. William Sebold, the double agent whose cooperation had made the entire investigation possible, faced his own complicated aftermath. His identity and role were made public during the trial, meaning that his value as a future intelligence asset was eliminated. More significantly, his cooperation with the FBI had marked him as a traitor in the eyes of German intelligence and German authorities. Any family members he had in Germany were now at risk of retaliation. The FBI provided Sebold with a new identity and relocated him to California, where he lived under an assumed name for the rest of his life. According to declassified FBI documents, Sebold experienced significant psychological difficulties, including depression, anxiety, and guilt about the role he had played in sending people to prison, even though his cooperation had been undertaken to protect American national security. He died in 1970 at the age of 66. Having spent the last 30 years of his life living quietly under an assumed identity. The Duquesne spy ring case had significant implications for American counterintelligence practices and for FBI capabilities. The successful investigation demonstrated the value of double-agent operations and the potential for turning recruited spies into assets who could expose broader networks. The techniques developed during the Sebold operation, including the use of controlled radio communications, the filming of meetings through two-way mirrors, and the coordination of long-term surveillance operations, became models for subsequent FBI counterintelligence work. The case also exposed vulnerabilities in defense contractor security practices. The fact that Hermann Lang had been able to photograph classified documents at the Norden Company for years without detection suggested serious deficiencies in physical security, personnel monitoring, and classification management. Following the convictions, the Department of War and the Department of the Navy implemented enhanced security protocols at defense contractors, including more stringent background checks for employees with access to classified information, improved physical security measures for document storage and handling, and increased counterintelligence monitoring of individuals in sensitive positions. For the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover specifically, the case represented a significant accomplishment that enhanced the Bureau's reputation and expanded its authority. Hoover promoted the Duquesne case extensively in public appearances and in communications with Congress and the executive branch, using it as evidence that the FBI possessed sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities. The Bureau's jurisdiction and authority over foreign intelligence matters expanded significantly during and after World War II, with the Duquesne case serving as a key precedent and justification. However, the case also raised questions about civil liberties and government surveillance powers. The FBI's investigation had involved extensive wiretapping, physical surveillance, mail monitoring, and the filming of individuals without their knowledge. While these techniques had been employed against foreign agents engaged in espionage, they represented a significant expansion of domestic surveillance capabilities that would become more pronounced and controversial in subsequent decades. The question of motivation remained complex even decades after the convictions. For some, like Hermann Lang, the motivation appeared deeper than simple patriotism. Lang had left Germany as a 36-year-old adult with established identity and connections. His sense of himself as German had not been erased by 13 years in America or by his naturalization. But beyond lingering loyalty, his continued espionage over 4 years suggested other psychological factors: the satisfaction of feeling valued and important, the intellectual challenge of covertly photographing documents, the sense of participating in historically significant events. The fact that he received modest payment suggested financial motivation played some role, but interviews conducted with him during parole hearings in the 1950s revealed a man still struggling to articulate why he had made the choices he had made. For Frederick Duquesne, the motivation seemed to be a complex mixture of ideology, personal psychology, and long-term identity as an intelligence operative. Duquesne had spent much of his adult life involved in espionage and clandestine activities. His professed hatred of Britain and his sympathy for Germany's position in the 1930s provided ideological justification for his activities, but his continued involvement in intelligence work across decades suggested that ideology alone was insufficient explanation. For others, particularly newer immigrants or individuals with family members still living in Germany, coercion and fear appeared to play significant roles. Several defendants testified that they had been approached by German intelligence officers during visits to Germany and had been told that cooperation was expected, with implicit or explicit threats about consequences for relatives if they refused. FBI investigations supported the conclusion that at least some defendants had faced genuine pressure from German authorities. The legal and moral responsibility of the defendants remained clear regardless of their motivations. They had chosen to commit espionage. They had stolen classified information. They had transmitted that information to a hostile foreign power. They had done so repeatedly over extended periods. They bore responsibility for those choices and for the consequences those choices produced. Yet understanding why they made those choices required acknowledging the complex interplay of nationalism, identity, pressure, rationalization, and circumstance that shaped their decision-making. These were not, for the most part, ideological zealots committed to Nazi ideology. Most were ordinary people, mechanics, hairdressers, ship's stewards, who had found themselves in situations where committing espionage seemed like an acceptable choice, or at least an unavoidable one, and who had then found themselves ensnared in consequences they had not fully anticipated. The role of ethnicity and immigration in the case raised uncomfortable questions that were relevant in 1941 and remained relevant decades later. Many of the convicted spies were German immigrants or children of German immigrants. They had been recruited based on ethnic and cultural connections to Germany and appeals to national loyalty. However, drawing broad conclusions about German Americans based on this case would have been unjustified and dangerous. The vast majority of German immigrants and German Americans were loyal American citizens who did not engage in espionage. Many served in American military forces during World War II. The Duquesne spy ring represented a tiny fraction of the German-American population, 33 individuals out of millions. The FBI investigation had deliberately avoided treating German ethnicity as evidence of disloyalty. The investigation focused on specific individuals whose activities raised suspicion, followed evidence, and documented criminal conduct. This approach contrasted sharply with the treatment of Japanese Americans following Pearl Harbor, when approximately 120,000 individuals, most of them American citizens, were forcibly relocated to internment camps based on ethnicity rather than any evidence of individual disloyalty. By the 1960s and 1970s, most of the principal figures in the case had died. The case gradually faded from public memory, overshadowed by later espionage cases during the Cold War and by changing geopolitical circumstances as the United States and West Germany became close allies. The FBI continued to use the case in training programs as an example of successful counterintelligence tradecraft. For historians and researchers studying World War II espionage, the case provided insights into how intelligence networks operated, how they were organized, and how they were ultimately compromised. The question that lingered was whether any of it had mattered in ways the participants intended or hoped. As the post-war assessments would show, Hermann Lang's theft accomplished little of strategic value. The bomb site specifications that had cost him everything were never successfully exploited by German forces. Frederick Duquesne had believed he was providing valuable intelligence about Allied capabilities. Did his reports influence German strategic planning or U-boat operations? The record suggested minimal impact, particularly after the FBI gained control of his communications channels. The defendants had risked and ultimately lost their freedom, their families, and their futures based on beliefs about the significance and necessity of what they were doing. Those beliefs turned out to be largely illusory. The information they provided either had minimal practical value or was controlled and manipulated by FBI handlers to prevent genuine harm. Their sacrifices, and the sacrifices imposed on their families, accomplished little beyond earning them decades in federal prison. This gap between intention and consequence characterized many intelligence operations. People made choices that seemed rational or necessary at the time, based on partial information and on assumptions about how their actions would matter. Then events unfolded in ways they had not anticipated, producing outcomes that bore little resemblance to what they had intended. Hermann Lang was 46 years old when he began photographing classified documents at the Norden Company in 1937. He was 50 when he was arrested in 1941. He was 67 when he was deported to Germany in 1958. And 77 when he died alone in Stuttgart in 1968. In between, he lost his freedom, his marriage, his home, his career, and any hope of reconciling with the wife who had divorced him and who wanted nothing more to do with him. Frederick Duquesne was 59 years old when he began organizing the spy network in the mid-1930s. He was 64 when he was convicted in 1941, and 78 when he died in a prison medical facility in 1956, having spent the last 15 years of his life incarcerated, far from the wife who had left him and from any family who might have mourned him. The information they provided to Germany, ship movements, technical specifications, industrial capacity assessments, was filed in intelligence archives in Berlin and Hamburg, analyzed by German military planners, and then largely forgotten as more pressing concerns occupied attention, as Allied bombing destroyed records and facilities, and as the war's momentum shifted decisively against Germany. Whether any specific military decision or operation was influenced by information from the Duquesne ring remained unknown and probably unknowable. What was certain was that 33 people went to federal prison, families were destroyed, children grew up traumatized and ashamed, and lives were permanently altered for goals that were never achieved and for purposes that ultimately proved hollow.